Welcome to a special edition of the ExecMBA podcast and Experience Darden podcast. I'm your host, Brett Twitty, and you are listening to a new episode. On this episode of the podcast, I'm excited to share my recent conversation with Professor Bobby Parmar. Bobby is the Shannon Smith Emerging Scholar in Business here at the Darden School of Business. He's also Associate Professor of Business Administration in the Strategy, Ethics, and Entrepreneurship area. Bobby and I recently connected via Zoom to talk more about his background, what he enjoys about teaching business ethics, the approach to ethics here at the Darden School, and so much more. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. So without further ado, here's my interview with Bobby Parmar. Bobby, welcome to the podcast.
Brett, thanks so much for having me on.
It's great to have you here. Before we get started, how are you doing?
Thanks for asking. I'm really grateful. I feel like, we've gone through so much, as a country, as a school, as individuals, and I am feeling really hopeful. I got to say, the other week when I saw folks getting the first doses of vaccine on the news, I got a little teary-eyed. I think it's a pretty amazing human accomplishment to go from, this virus that we didn't know very much about to multiple effective vaccines in less than a year. And I'm going to keep on keeping on with the health and safety protocols to get to the end in sight here. So trying to stay hopeful. But I think like many of us, I think we're all getting fatigued.
Well, there's just a lot right now. I understand, and you're so right to note the sort of historic achievement of developing a vaccine in less than a year. I mean, everybody talked about, what was it, mumps? It was like a 4-year development or something like that. And so just the efficacy of the vaccines, how quickly they were turned around, just truly amazing. I wonder, have you picked up any hobbies, anything that you're doing here in the midst of the pandemic?
That is a funny question. Usually pre-COVID, I am traveling a lot. I'm working with executives and companies and teaching and giving research talks. And the last 8 months not traveling, one of the things that I've picked up is eating much healthier and working out. So kind of health and wellness have moved to the top of my list. They've always been to the top of my list, except now I have more time to do something about it. So that's been pretty great. And then spending more time with my kids, which is phenomenal. Pre-COVID, a lot of it was leave work, rush to pick somebody up from soccer practice, drop somebody else off at ballet, quickly shovel food in your mouth, wake up, and it's 6 months later. It just goes so fast. And now we have some time to play games together and go for longer walks together. And I feel really blessed to have that time with them.
I'm glad to hear that you and your family are doing well. And again, thank you so much for taking some time out for the podcast. So we start off with the same sort of series of questions, kind of set the stage a bit. Tell us a little bit more about you and your background.
Awesome. So kind of a big picture, I am a faculty member here at the Darden School. I teach business ethics and some courses on critical thinking, collaboration. I'm the son of immigrants. I'm the father of 2 amazing young women. I'm by training a moral philosopher and a social psychologist. Lots of different interesting kind of identity pieces, but those I'd say are some of my most central important pieces of my identity.
Well, let's talk about how you gravitated towards business ethics, moral philosophy. I mean, how did you get into this work?
Yeah, an interesting question. I didn't predict this. I never imagined this for myself. I think like most good Indian American boys, I was going to be a doctor to make my parents happy. And I did pre-med the first half of undergraduate. And I kind of woke up halfway through my second year and I was like, I don't think I want to do this. And had a little bit of a crisis about what I was going to do. And thankfully in my network, I had some business school faculty here at Darden who were like, hey, why don't you come be an RA. I need some help putting this class together. I need you to help me do some research. And it was an opportunity for me to see what life was like for a faculty member. What is research? What do we do? What does that mean? How do they go about teaching? How do they improve practice? And I spent a couple of years really learning what that was. And I kind of fell in love with it. I fell in love with, the life of the mind and the applied nature of it as well, like researching ideas, finding ways to do things better, and then helping individuals and organizations actually live that. And what interests me in moral philosophy and the kinds of social psychological things that I do is that it's human-centered. for so long, the dominant discourse about business has been a discourse that is rooted in economics and finance. And that sanitizes out for the most part, not so much nowadays. Nowadays, there's a lot of really interesting finance scholars and economists who are doing interesting work at the intersection of economics and the humanities. But for a long time, those disciplines sanitized out human beings and human complexity. And by bringing a lens of social psychology, bringing a lens of moral philosophy, we get to really understand human beings and how they work, which is integral to leading a successful business.
Well, it's an interesting point that you make, because when I think about business, you think about what's going on. It's the social enterprise, right? There's people involved in this.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes our theories of what makes a business work or what a business is sometimes puts the people in the background. And I'm really passionate about helping folks better understand human beings, better understand themselves, and build the skills to lead human beings to do great things. I'm a believer in the ideal that business can be a force for good in this world. I don't know that we always live up to that, but I think it's an ideal worth pursuing.
So you came to Darden as a research assistant, and you're now on the faculty. Tell us a little bit more about the arc from research assistant to faculty member.
So I was a research assistant here for about 3 years, and because I really got interested in business ethics, I wanted to get my PhD, and I wanted to get my PhD at the place that was most well known. And so I applied to the joint MBA PhD program here at Darden. I was lucky enough to be accepted, and that was, I did the 2 years of the MBA, and then I was around for 4 years to do the PhD. And after that, the plan was to go somewhere else. I always wanted to come back, because I think if you get your MBA here, you kind of fall in love with the place and what we stand for. And so the goal was to go somewhere and then to come back after some time. And I was fortunate enough to get the opportunity to teach, and things went well, and they gave me the offer to stay, and I wasn't sure if I should take it or not. I think it's really difficult, and it's not very common to transition from doctoral student to faculty member in the same institution. There's only a handful of places that do that. Like HBS has some folks that have come up through their doctoral program. But I rolled the dice, and I've been really happy. This is my 13th year teaching at Darden. So overall, I'm really happy with that choice.
We've had some folks here on the podcast that have talked about the orientation to business ethics at Darden, stakeholder theory is kind of a way of viewing the world. I imagine for some of our listeners just learning a little bit more about the school, this might be new language to them, or they're just kind of orienting to this. Would you share a little bit more about kind of how Darden thinks about business ethics and what all this means?
Lots to talk about. So, when we go to business ethics conferences or we meet other business ethicists at other top business schools, a lot of their work is compliance focused and based in the law. And so a lot of business school students get a view of business ethics that is rooted in the thou shalt nots. Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not break this law, thou shalt comply with particular regulation XYZ. And ultimately, I think at Darden, we start with a very different assumption. We start with the assumption that if you don't already know not to lie, cheat, and steal, there's really nothing that a quarter or 14 sessions with us is going to do about that, right? We start with the assumption that our students are fundamentally good people who want to try to do the right thing, but many times in life, the right thing to do is not clear. There's conflicting priorities, there's different rules and regulations, there's different harms and benefits. And so we approach ethics as a critical thinking activity. We approach ethics as a way of thinking about complex problems. And so, I was actually fascinated a few years ago to find some interesting research. The National Institute of Health and the National Science Foundation actually had an ethics problem where many of the scientists who were applying for grants from these large institutions were actually fudging the numbers and cheating to try to get grant money. And so they said, hey, look, we want to do something about this, but what do we do about it? So they commissioned some research on what actually makes ethics instruction effective. Because a lot of ethics instruction is not effective. A lot of folks will take some online course. Maybe their companies will ask them to do a course on compliance. These things don't have a strong research basis in terms of actual effectiveness. But there are some things that are effective when you engage students in real problems that they care about, when you give them practice with a problem-solving methodology that they can apply to a variety of problems. Those kinds of things are associated with actual increases in performance. And that's how we approach teaching ethics at Darden.
So you learned at Darden through the case method. I would imagine, I say this as someone who sat in on a mock ethics class with Andy Wicks last summer with our incoming executive MBA class of 2022s, and they loved it. They had, I mean, I felt like that conversation could have gone on for like 4 or 5 hours. It must be, it's not to say that accounting and finance classes and case method aren't also compelling, but I would think ethics is just, I mean, you could talk about some of these things forever.
Yeah, and ethics is a place where a lot of these other disciplines come together, right? Many of our ethics cases, we ask people to run the numbers, or they have strategic implications, or they also have implications to, how we communicate with the folks that we lead. And so it's a place where we integrate lots of different kinds of disciplines within the business school. But I think case method works really well in ethics because it also brings out the humanity of our students. They have a stake, they have a set of values, they are learning from each other. And, I always try to talk about Darden as a high engagement learning school. Case method is an important part of that. It's the cornerstone of high engagement. But we do lots of different things that are high engagement, whether that's simulations or projects or role plays. There's lots of ways in which we, first and foremost, engage our students in the learning process. It's not a passive process, it's an active process. And case method, I think, is very, very good at that. We think together, we argue with each other, we learn from each other. And one of the things that I learned as an MBA student at Darden is that when you're in a classroom with all of these amazing folks with so many different backgrounds, you're learning vicariously just by listening to their comments. And you're engaging the parts of your brain that are social as well, because here's your friend or this other person that's on your learning team. And the fact that they made this comment, it actually sticks in your brain better than if it's just the faculty member saying all the things or most of the things, right? And so you're engaging more of your brain in the learning process in a case method style discussion, because you're engaging the social parts of your brain as well as the parts of the brain that are, understanding what's being said.
So you're a movie producer as well. I should note. Do you have an IMDb profile?
I don't have an IMDb profile. This is my one and only movie producing credit.
Okay, for our listeners, it's called Fishing with Dynamite. You can find it on the Darden website. You can also find it where movies are found. Tell us a little bit more about this movie.
So the idea for this documentary film was born out of a conference that we hosted here at Darden. Every couple of years, we have some of the most prominent stakeholder scholars from around the world come to Darden and share their research and insights and projects that they're working on. And we had a fantastic 2.5-day conference. People were really energized. And leaving that conference, I was simultaneously excited, but also disappointed. And disappointed because I think these were really important conversations about issues that we care about in society, but it felt like a very closed conversation. It felt like a bunch of academics talking about really important things. And so we produced this film to try to take some of these ideas and make them accessible to folks who are not academics studying stakeholder theory. And so Fishing with Dynamite is a film. We partnered with a local filmmaker named Paul Wagner, who just happened to have won an Academy Award for a documentary film. Fantastic individual, threw himself into learning about what stakeholder theory is and what that means. And the idea is to really think through the purpose of business. What is that? What are different ways in which scholars and practitioners have thought about it and actually implement it? And so the film profiles 3 different companies of different sizes. There's a small startup, or it was a small startup at the time, Luke's Lobster, that focuses on sustainable harvesting of seafood and working with local communities to enrich those communities. At the time, there was a company, the Container Store at the time had just gone public. And so it was really interesting to see this transition from a privately held company to a publicly held company. And then the large kind of global corporation was Eastman. And they produce a variety of materials that go into millions of products, from your toothbrush to your windshield. And each of these firms are stakeholder-oriented firms. They care about the impact of their actions on their employees and their communities and their supplier networks and their shareholders. They are performing incredibly well because I think they take care of their stakeholders.
What's the origin of the title of the movie?
Oh, there's a line in the film. One of the thought leaders we interviewed, Lynn Stout, a law professor at the time at Cornell. She passed away. Just an amazing intellect. Lynn talked about this idea that the way that we focus on short-term shareholder profits and we do anything to get those profits up is like fishing with dynamite. You throw a stick of dynamite into the lake and you catch a lot of fish. But over time, the more and more you do that, there are fewer and fewer fish. And we're degrading the ecosystem and the environment of that lake only because we think we're going to catch more fish, right? And focusing only on short-term shareholder profits is very much like that, because we do a bunch of things to get that share price up that ends up harming the long-term viability and sustainability of those businesses.
Is very interesting to consider. I think one of the things that it seems like might be happening out there is that stakeholder theory seems to be gaining broader and broader traction. Now, I say this to somebody, I'm reading the news, I'm just following what seems to be going on out there. What's your impression of this?
I do think, in the short amount of time I've been doing this compared to many of my colleagues, I have seen a larger embrace of these ideas. And particularly, through the pandemic, it was an opportunity for companies to really prove what they stood for, to take care of their communities and their environments. And folks are looking around and seeing and remembering like who was with them and who wasn't, really, who really didn't believe those things. And so I do see more and more organizations adopting the stakeholder philosophy, and I think that's very heartening. I also think that adopting the philosophy and saying the words is an important first step, but it's a first step, right? And I think companies have to embed this philosophy into the way they do business all the time, into the way that they recruit and hire, into the way that they promote folks, into the way that they negotiate with their suppliers, right? In the way they update and interact with their shareholders. And so that's really the wave of work that we're seeing now, is more and more companies are saying, yes, we believe that the way of doing business where you take care of stakeholder relationships is the way to do business. Now, how do we do that in a way that actually is embedded in our systems and processes and the way that we do work every day?
That seems like it would take quite a bit of effort. It might be a longer term project. You talked about the sort of tension between short term thinking, right? So the pressures on share price, for example, for publicly traded companies, and this idea that maybe moving towards this stakeholder perspective and thinking about these things might require a long term perspective. How do you get companies to sort of, value the longer term and not be so focused on the short term?
Yeah, I think actually, when you speak with executives, they do value the long term. They actually want to manage for the long term, but they feel a lot of pressure to manage for the short term. And I think that there are a variety of experiments that are being run to try to create a little more degrees of freedom, some more latitude for executives to manage in the long term. I don't know that any of these experiments have kind of been proven as the best way of doing things, but there are folks who are working to help change how quarterly calls are run. And instead of focusing on short-term earnings, focusing on long-term strategy. There's an initiative underway for what's called the long-term stock exchange, where companies who would list on this stock exchange would have a certain fixed amount of time where you could hold that stock, where you're holding it for the long term rather than flipping it as soon as it goes up. B Corps, I think, are an experiment. Some executives are saying, look, we're just going to give up saying that we care about profit. We're just going to say we're a benefit corporation and focus on societal benefit, even though they need profits to sustain those benefits, right? I'm not sure what I think about that, but I do think it's one of those things that allows executives a little bit more latitude. And there's also more and more publicly listed companies that are going private. They're finding, private equity firms, they're finding other investors who can basically buy out their public shares and who they're like-minded with so that they believe the long-term philosophy of the firm. For example, Panera, a couple of years ago, I think it's 2017, Panera went from a public company to a private company. And the CEO at the time basically said, all the things that made Panera great are the things that are under attack when we're as a publicly traded company. And I want to make this a company that lasts for the long term. That's why we're taking it private.
So interesting to think about it. It does seem like like it's a time where increasingly consumers want to know what a company stands for and what the values are. And that it seemed, I mean, sort of be ascendant, and it's happening, but it seems to have really accelerated over the past few years. Is that your impression as well?
I think so too. I think there are pros and cons of that, right? Like I do think more and more of our purchases, we want to reflect our values. And so it also raises some interesting questions, right? It raises questions about which of my values do I want to see reflected in this purchase? Maybe it's environmental friendliness. Maybe we feel a little bit less comfortable with that when it's political values. Unclear, but we're also seeing that kind of pressure. And so I don't know that we found a model. Like the model seems to be evolving, right? And I think people are wrestling with the pros and cons of having more and more of our values reflected in every purchase decision that we make.
But this must be the really interesting thing about your work, is that it's constantly evolving, constantly changing. I have to imagine that that is a source of energy and inspiration for you.
Never a dull moment.
So what are you working on right now?
Oh, I got a lot going on, but one project that I'm really excited about right now is a collaboration with one of my co-authors at Harvard Business School and another co-author at George Washington University. And what we're doing is we're studying teams and how they communicate to solve what are called insight problems, or basically tasks that require innovation. So some of the data for this project I collected with Darden MBA students. We took 60 Darden MBA students to the local Charlottesville escape room. In teams of 4, they tried to escape the room within an hour, and we had mounted GoPro cameras on their heads. We were measuring their heart rate and their galvanic skin response and things like that. And then after they finished, we transcribed everything that they said, and we started to look for patterns that distinguished teams that were successful from teams that really struggled. And so we've replicated this with online samples, and we're finding some really interesting things. So for example, teams that struggle tend to try to solve the puzzles in their head before speaking to others. Teams that do really well are not afraid to share half-baked ideas, or ideas that might be considered silly. Somebody else builds on them, and over time, they solve the puzzles much more quickly. Another interesting preliminary finding, this isn't published yet, but it is a strong finding in the data, is that individuals that speak with certainty, I know that this opens this lock, or this must be the right answer, actually shut down participation from others. It's when people speak with a little bit of uncertainty or doubt. I wonder if, maybe this does this. I'm not sure if, what do you think? It actually invites other people to build on their ideas, and the team performs more effectively. And finally, my favorite finding is the more laughter on the team, the more hypotheses they generate. The more hypotheses they generate, the quicker they solve the puzzles and escape the room, which is pretty cool.
These are some good tips for our incoming students as they think about working with their learning teams.
Yeah, for sure. And a lot of my teaching in the MBA program, we have a couple of experiences that actually put students in that exact same situation and then show some of the research insights from these larger samples.
Or are you teaching right now? Do you have a class going?
Yeah, just started up this week. Really excited to be back in the classroom. I'm teaching 2 sections in the residential program of business ethics.
All right. Where do you start in the class? I'm just always curious, like as you're sort of you're a few classes in, where do you choose to start students in that conversation?
The initial case that we have is a case, it's an old case, but it's a really interesting case about a pharmaceutical company, Merck, and their decision to pursue this drug called Mectizan that could cure this disease that plagued the third world called river blindness, but the folks who needed the medicine couldn't pay for it. So basically, you've got to make this decision. Do I pursue this drug that could alleviate a tremendous amount of suffering in the world, but there's very little chance that there'll ever be payback for this huge investment? And what's interesting is students kind of dive in, and even though it's a pretty famous case, I find that most of my students have not heard of it, and they certainly don't know that the scientist at Merck who was in charge of this particular stream of research won the Nobel Prize for Medicine. And kind of a really interesting recent finding is that this particular compound actually has been shown to reduce COVID deaths by 75%. And so it's an interesting decision that gets students to wrestle with their view of the purpose of business. How does mission fit in? How does purpose fit in? How should we think about the financial implications of our decisions? And I think early on in the class, students tend to focus on a single criteria. And the students tend to kind of fall into groups. They tend to make decisions either that are mission oriented, or they tend to make decisions that are financially oriented. And ultimately, what we try to get them to see is that these are multi-criteria problems. We've got to make decisions that take into account both mission and profits. If we only make decisions based on the mission, we might not be around to actually execute that mission. And if we only make decisions based on profit, we might not be able to achieve what we want to achieve in the world. And so helping them navigate these complex multi-criteria issues is a good place to start.
Gosh, that's so interesting. I will say, knowing our executive MBA students well, I know I've heard them talking about that case, and just that it's one of those cases where naturally the conversation continues to flow outside of the classroom. They break, they're talking about it. I know it's the same for our full-time MBA residential students. If someone was interested in learning more about stakeholder theory, undoubtedly there are people listening to this conversation right now saying, gosh, this sounds interesting. I might go watch the movie, might read something. Where would you encourage someone to start? I know it's a ton of research, and this is it's hard to ask this question. So
I think the easiest way to put a toe into this conversation is to start by watching the film Fishing with Dynamite, available on iTunes right now. And there's also a great website called stakeholdertheory.org. And it has a couple of great talks by prominent stakeholder theorists like our very own Ed Freeman. And it also has a lot of books and articles. And so if you kind of want to roll up your sleeves and start to do the reading, that's a great place to start. If you want to get a sense of these ideas and what they mean in practice, the film is a great place to start.
Well, thank you for those recommendations, Bobby. I wonder, so it sounds like what you and your colleagues are hoping that students develop is a framework for thinking about things, an approach. When you think about Darden alumni in the world and this sort of training that they're getting here and thinking about these problems, what do you hope for them? What do you hope that they carry with them into their careers as they approach, complicated, ambiguous decisions that they're having to make?
Oh, what a great question. There's so many things I hope for. I hope first and foremost that they have a sense of efficacy, that they feel like, even in trying uncertain times, that there's an opportunity to live their values and to make the world a better place, even if it's marginally so, right? So that they don't give up when things get hard. The second is that I hope that we've given them tools and techniques to structure their thinking, to learn from others, to test, and to kick the tires on the way that they're thinking about things so that they can actually be as effective as they need to be in the world. We need great leadership in the world right now. We need fantastic leaders at every level in the organization, and the kinds of things that happen in the Darden, MBA program are really helpful for leaders to build their capacity to make the world a better place. And I also think that, one of the things that I value as a Darden alumni myself is the amazing network. That lots of times in life we come up against a situation where we don't know what to do, but there's someone in my network who might have a point of view on it or who might have experienced something similar, and Darden alums are really good at returning emails and picking up the phone and saying, hey, I'd be happy to share my perspective with you. And so that's just an invaluable resource.
All right. Well, I'll always try to wrap up with the same kind of last question, variation on theme here. But any words of advice for our prospective student listeners, anything you would encourage them to think about? It can be really anything that you think would be helpful.
Geez, when I think about my time at Darden, it was one of my favorite times in my life. I learned so much. I would say, be ready to be pushed and be ready to grow tremendously. And what surprised me the most is how much fun I had in that process. And so I guess I'd say, be ready to be pushed, be ready to grow, and be ready to have more fun than you think you'll have.
Well, Bobby, thank you so much for your time today. It's been great talking with you. I so appreciate your taking some time out for the podcast. I hope you and your family stay safe and have a great weekend.
Same to you, Brett. Thanks so much.
And that was my interview with Bobby Parmar, Associate Professor of Business Administration here at the Darden School of Business. As always, if you have any comments, suggestions, requests, anything you'd like for us to cover here on the podcast, we're all ears. We can be reached at Darden, that's DARDEN, at virginia.edu. Until next time, stay safe, be well, and thanks for listening.